the west bank of Southampton Water, in full view of the great transatlantic liners that use the port of Southampton, stands the present refinery of the Anglo-American Oil Company. Impressive as it is, it will be dwarfed in 2 or 3 years' time by one that will be the largest in Europe, costing about £37.5 million to erect. The site is an ideal one because there are excellent deep water facilities and 4 tides a day. Also, it is most conveniently placed for the distribution of the refinery's products. In the summer of 1949, Cadland House, near the old village of Fawley and for long unoccupied, looked out on scenes of harvesting in a typically southern English countryside. But agriculture is only one of the many necessary claims on this land of ours. For centuries, the countryside has been, as it were, clay, not in the hands of the potter, but in the hands of those that plan our cities, ports, mines, industries, and all else that has made England great. And in these days, farming must be practiced with greater intensity than ever before. It cannot be undertaken without machinery, and machinery cannot function without oil. The cycle is as simple as that. But sentimentalists do not often realize it. So land must be sacrificed for the production of oil, just as oak trees in the nearby New Forest had to be sacrificed for the building of the British fleet in the days when ships were made of wood. In short, in the accomplishment of great enterprises, the use of natural resources is unavoidable. If it were not, they would not be resources. June 1949. This was the scene near Park Lodge. On this spot, a little moment of life had been recorded. And now, on this same spot and all around it, history was to be made in the nation's industrial life and progress. Time was when no beech trees stood here, and perhaps history is not going to change so much as repeat itself. Once again, there will be no tree. Eventually, there will be no lodge. That, too, will disappear. But demolition and creation are inseparable. The wood of these trees is urgently required for 1,000 purposes, and for every tree cut down, 2 are to be planted. When the refinery is completed, it will be screened by a belt of trees 100 to 150 feet wide, in keeping with the surrounding countryside. The site covers 970 acres. That is nearly 3 times the size of Hyde Park, or 8 times that of Esso House, and practically rubbed shoulders with the old refinery. That was another reason for the selection of this site, which has the further merit of being fairly flat, with a formation that allows of quick and cheap development. The subsoil is sand and gravel. The work of tree felling proceeded at a pace which, fast though it was, subsequent operations not only maintained, but always strove to exceed. Beeches, oaks, and elms were no sooner down than they were lopped, sawn to suitable lengths, and taken away off the site to the sawmills. A modest contribution to the present timber shortage. So it was that from Cadland House, the old scenes of farming gave place to new vistas, of what was undoubtedly at this stage beginning to be a bald and ugly composition. When the larger trees had been felled, the bush, scrub, and small trees were hustled out of the way by bulldozers. To watch them at it was to be deceived by the speed at which they were working. In a very short time, the entire area was methodically cleared of vegetation, and the ground left ready for the constructive stages that were to follow. Any particularly obstinate roots and stumps left in the wake of the bulldozers were quickly dealt with by small charges of explosive. Within a month, the trees and hedges that we see here had vanished, and the site had been transformed into this unrecognizable picture. No better impression can be given of the rate of progress in those early days. Only 1 month ago, the beech tree by Park Lodge was still standing. And here is that view now from the same angle. The stump of the tree is in the foreground. But during this time, more had been done than clearing the ground. a new railway had to be laid down from the old refinery to the new one, and this was to run through the trees at the back of Cadland House. The ground here was not so level as elsewhere, so the construction of a cutting in this section and an embankment beyond was imperative. This work involved the transfer of many thousands of tons of soil, and a fleet of lorries loaded by a mechanical grab was continually on the move between the cutting and the embankment, simultaneously reducing the level of one and raising the level of the other. On the site itself, an area was first cleared for the construction camp that was to accommodate many hundreds of the 4,500 men eventually to be employed on the project. These would be the men from other parts of the country living away from their homes. In September 1949, only 3 months after starting to prepare the ground, this site had reached an advanced stage and rippers were loosening the soil in readiness for the scrapers. But by no means all the work was mechanical, and throughout this period, manual labor was in constant demand, especially on the extensive drainage system and similar activities. Hard on the heels of the rippers came the huge scrapers. These juggernauts lumbered over the land, scooping up a ton or more of soil in one place, skimming the surface elsewhere, and leaving behind them a level redistribution of the ground to await the laying of the first foundations. At the end of July, you will remember, the site looked like this. A couple of months later, viewed from precisely the same angle, it had this appearance. And now the street plan was being marked out. Certainly no time was being lost, and for the speed and smoothness with which the project was taking shape, one must applaud not only the men who were giving of their best on the job, but those who were less in evidence, the white-collar men whose calculations and care had made the whole vast conception possible. By this time, the one and only trace of the land's former preoccupation with agriculture was an old farm wagon. The land was becoming familiar now with vehicles of a very different kind. Vehicles that moved not on wheels behind horses, lurching into every rut and pothole, but on caterpillar tracks and without difficulty over the softest and hardest patches of ground alike. In other words, the bulldozers, rippers and scrapers were out and about and in their element, and things were beginning to move fast. And at last the day came when the old farm wagon itself hitched to one of these mechanical intruders and hauled away to spend the rest of its life in surroundings to which it was accustomed. On almost the same day, the Fort Moscato began unloading at Southampton the first of those supplies that had of necessity to come from America. Much of this cargo consisted of specially designed girders for the construction of the Austin building. That is, the maintenance shops which will be the largest in Europe. But it should be mentioned at this point that no ECA dollars are involved in the construction of the refinery. It is a private enterprise project which is known to ECA and which fits in with the general picture of European recovery because it will save dollars. The saving will be large because greatly increased shipments of crude petroleum from the Middle East will be refined at Fawley instead of our having to import the more costly refined products. At this time also, the first 2 storage tanks were going up, the great sections being welded together by workmen perched on planks high above the ground on both sides of it. Perhaps it was the appearance of these tanks, the first hint of the shape of things to come, or perhaps it was the way in which various parts of the site could now be seen in relation to one another that inculcated into every man on the job a certain pride in the development of the project. On the railway in particular, the ultimate layout became discernible. The increasing friendliness of the local ponies was also discernible. A sense of achievement began to make itself felt among those who had done so much in so short a time. The quickening tempo of the work called for more frequent consultations between the experts in charge of it, and especially between the project engineer, Mr. Cole, and those directly responsible with him, Mr. Feely, Mr. Maguire, and Mr. Holden Sr. When an undertaking of this magnitude is, so to speak, gathering momentum, any delays or steps in the wrong direction might not only be difficult to rectify, but could also have repercussions on the economic life of an entire country. Therefore, to say that these men and others whom we cannot meet here were carrying a lot of responsibility is something of an understatement. To say that the construction camp was progressing satisfactorily is also an understatement. The huts were going up like a row of tents, and though not permanent, were substantial enough to give a satisfactory degree of comfort to their occupants. On a project of this size, it is always difficult to get an idea of the number of men engaged on it, so scattered and varied are their individual jobs, even where many are working together on one specific process. Some idea of the speed at which these huts were erected can be gained by watching how the walls were made. They were not built brick by brick or even block by block, but wall by wall in one piece. Cement was mixed in bulk, poured into containers, and swung by cranes to the spot where it was needed. There it was poured into large mesh frames which acted as a mold for one complete wall. Left to dry overnight. The next day, the mesh frames were removed, leaving a solid wall behind them, and swung into position at the other end of the hut, where the process was repeated. Already the bald and barren look of the site was beginning to disappear. In November, the foundations of the first of the new roads were well advanced. This one crosses the new railway at a point near Park Lodge. And if no actual signs of competition were perceptible between road makers and railwaymen, it virtually existed, as it always will between the various parties at work on a job of this magnitude. The only sleepers here were those that required 4 men to lift and place each of them in position. Incidentally, it is hoped to draw some part of the labor force as the work progresses from the Midlands and the North, where suitable labor may be available. But local labor in Southampton was naturally given precedence. And now the railway was beginning to look like a railway. this time also, towers had been erected for water boring operations. Oil and water may not mix, but in a lot of cases, they certainly work together very well. From the top of the water tower, a good view is obtainable of the road to the marine terminal. This runs dead straight past the present refinery. Talking of the marine terminal brings us to Southampton Water, where bore testing was in progress near the projected site of the new jetties. These have been designed for 26,000-ton tankers, and another merit of the site, besides the diurnal four tides, is the easy flowing current. Even at this early stage of the work, the building of a new clubhouse and cinema was making rapid strides. Elsewhere, a somewhat more urgent and more severely practical requirement was in course of construction. This was the concrete and aggregate plant, which had now reached the stage when work could be started on the underground conveyor system. The plant was to draw its water from the engine pond, across which a dam had already been built. The water fed into this pond would be quite clean and ready for use. But water was not always so useful or welcome. And while mobile canteens could splash quite comfortably through this sort of mess, gum-booted surveyors and others found it slightly heavier going. However, as we all know, it is not really on our feet that we march as an army, but on our stomachs. Only a couple of months ago, you will remember, the Fort Mascaro was unloading girders for the Austin building. But already the framework of that structure, as can be seen here, was taking a definite shape. But today is payday, and when the welder has finished welding with his oxyacetylene lamp, he will turn it in for the weekend and join all the other artisans, technicians and workmen in the apparently casual but nevertheless grimly purposeful queue for pay. In February, with the worst of the winter past and 8 months of hard work completed, this placid pool of water testified that the concrete and aggregate plant was now in operation. This water had come from the plant and was being fed down to the engine pond. On the way, it dropped all its silt, and when it was quite clean, it was fed back to the plant. Gravel taken from a waterlogged sandpit was fed into the concrete and aggregate machine by a giant grab. In fact, one might say, were there any virtue in the fact, that in the making of this concrete, none of the ingredients was touched by hand at any point. Washed sand was brought along by a conveyor and dropped onto a large sand heap. The whole proceeding could be observed from the top of the concrete machine, just above the conveyor belt, continuously feeding the sand into the mixer. Time, traveling backwards and forwards from the concrete machine were the dump-creep trucks taking the wet concrete to various points all over the site. However, the actual loading of the trucks and the nature of their construction, which saves time, work and wastage, could be seen better at ground level. On arriving where the concrete was required, the dump-creep truck unloaded it into a ladle. This was duly swung round and emptied down a chute into the place prepared for it. In this case, the foundation for a pillar. And while the ladle was swung away for a further load, the workmen shoveled away what had been left on the chute. More cranes were engaged in the work of laying sewers, and mechanical grabs were delivering sand as required to the scene of operations. The size of these great sewer pipes and the trench in which they were laid gives a good idea of the scale on which the whole project has been conceived. It is worth noting that each section, before being laid in position itself, was used to knock tightly into position the previous section. If the sewer pipes looked large underground, they seemed even larger when lined up like this. But by this time, a great deal more had been lined up on the site. Buildings were springing up everywhere, and the Austin building had developed into a most impressive structure. As has already been said, it will be the largest maintenance shop in Europe, and will measure 800 feet long and 140 feet wide. It will contain the most up-to-date traveling cranes and the most modern systems of ventilation and lighting, all designed for the comfort of the workmen and for maximum efficiency. It will also reduce to a minimum the necessity for unsightly huts and temporary buildings on the site during the actual development period. With the installation now starting of huge underground oil pipes, the development period took another big step forward. After all, oil, so to speak, was the essence of the project, and the appearance of equipment such as this showed how much work had been done in only 8 months, starting from scratch. Yet only when the men on the job were knocking off for lunch was it possible to obtain some idea of the great numbers who were working on the 1,000-acre site. They came from one source and another like the tributaries of a river until they formed a solid, slow-moving stream. Although one or two rivulets capered past independently of the main body. By now, the exterior of the clubhouse and cinema was finished, and it looked a better job than many of the cinemas that are to be found in regular townships. By now, also, the heat exchange units had arrived on the site. Park Lodge, sitting like a nurse in the midst of growing children whom she both admired and deplored, looked out on scenes of ever-increasing dimensions and activity. In the midst of it all, a reminder of one of the many benefits that the project will bestow on the country, stood a petrol filling station. Let us get into the car and have a look at what has been happening to Cadland House, noting on the way that the first 2 storage tanks have almost been finished. The drive up to Cadland House had, of course, like everything else in these 8 months, changed out of all recognition, and was now flanked by pipes, timber, and stocks of every description. Bulldozers were at work within a stone's throw of the house, looking perhaps a little like trespassers on a private estate. But only in the immediate neighborhood of the house did the estate any longer look private. From the roof, one obtained a very different picture. And a very heartening picture to everyone who realized how much the prosperity of this country is going to be influenced by the efficiency with which this project is carried out and put into operation. Carpenters out in the open near the Austin building had their work cut out to keep pace with the demands made on them. does it. But more than one blow was needed, however heavy, when it came to driving concrete piles into the ground. These were required here, where it was marshy, as foundations for the road to the jetty. But as the necessity for them had been foreseen in the planning stage, no delay was caused and no alternative route had to be thought out. In all such matters, the greatest praise is due to the engineers, architects and other planners whose early work had taken into account every eventuality so far encountered. The end of each day at Fawley was bringing the work nearer to the end of the first year. When evening came and everyone knocked off, the men in twos and threes no longer walked away from a barren expanse of dead ground, but threaded their way over rapidly accumulating stocks and past new buildings, new scaffolding, and new scenes. This was their achievement, their creation, their contribution to the future. On the new railway, a new diesel locomotive was at work. And from the footplate, a good view could be obtained of Fawley as it was in February 1950. When the loco moved off on its last run of the day, we went with it. We traveled along the new embankment. Curved through the new cutting. Came in sight of the outskirts of the site, and not without affection, surveyed the new buildings which, so far from our having grown up with them, had in this case grown up with us. After only 9 months, Fawley was a sturdy infant. Very sure of itself, very healthy, and very determined, this great new oil refinery was moving forward not only to help fill the breach in our economic stability caused by the war, but also to keep pace with the future quality and quantity requirements of Esso fuels and lubricants.